It is admirable for a man to take his son fishing, but there is a special place in heaven for the father who takes his daughter shopping. John Sinner. This is Dadography, a podcast with stories and insights on fatherhood from dads around the globe, dedicated to providing you with the tools and tips to become a better dad. I'm your host, Corey Moore. All right. Once again, thank you for tuning in to the Dadography podcast. Today, we have a special guest, an attorney out of the United States of America, and we'll get more specifics from him in just a moment. And his name is Keith White. Keith, thank you very much for making some time for the Dadography podcast. Welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks for having me. I'm happy to be here and I'm honored, at the opportunity to discuss this.
Yeah, man. I had a chance to spend some time on your website. I was looking forward to communicating with you and just trying to vibe a little bit on being a dad, man. I think it's pretty awesome, but obviously getting different perspectives and insights is always of a tremendous value. But before we do jump into that, if you could, man, tell us a little bit about yourself.
I'm an attorney by trade. That's my practice. I'm also finishing up a doctorate at USC. I'm based out of Brooklyn, New York. I have a civil rights, general federal litigation practice, as well as some entertainment and intellectual property practice. I'm a husband and I'm a father of 5 incredible young ladies.
That's really something special, man. 5 girls. I have a friend of mine based out of Maryland who he and his wife have, they've got 7 kids, and he was adamant about having his son. And so apparently God had something different lined up for him. So he got six girls, and then finally he did get a boy. So, but the trend now, Keith, is girl dads, guys that are totally content with having daughters. Did you struggle with not having a boy, or is that, something that, was never an issue? I mean,
I think that other people struggled with me not having a boy. I think that, the concept is, you want to have strong men lead society, but that's a misnomer. That's been misleading. We need good people to lead society. And I think that, assigning gender, whether it be gender norms, standards, to who can actually lead, who's qualified to lead, has been one of the biggest problems in our society. Who can play basketball? Who can play sports? Who can do this? I don't think that it's been something that I've thought about. I thought about it as a measure of convenience, right? Like, I don't know how to do hair. I don't know how to necessarily pick out outfits and stuff like that for women, but I know how to do it for boy because I'm a man. So for me, it's a measure of convenience. But the idea of actually raising or being part of the process of raising a young woman has always been exciting for me. And so, yeah, we didn't keep going to try to get the son. We just were going because we love our family and we wanted to expand it.
So let me ask you this: in the midst of raising your girls, have you found that it has caused you to be less of a disciplinarian? Like, in other words, with your boys, you can easily tend to kind of be the rod of correction. With your girls, was it, or is it a little bit different, and your wife leans in more towards that side of things?
I think that there are certain things that naturally should come from a woman in terms of how to be a woman, right?
Right, of course.
And I think that, a man impressing upon a young woman what type of woman she should be is part of the problem with society, right? There's these patriarchal standards and privileges that men feel like they need to impress upon women. And if fathers do it to daughters, it becomes normalized in their lives later on, and they get used to being told what to do by men. And I think That's been a dynamic, we've been constantly trying to deal with in our household, making sure that we're not normalizing behaviors, oppressions, and ideologies that have caused trauma for us. And so making sure that now we're not replicating behaviors that are not healthy for our children. So I think that we're responsible for creating a framework that of safety, structure, trust around them. But I think that in many ways, our children raise us as opposed to us raising them.
How so?
So you have a concept, you have an idea about humanity, about how it exists, about how we exist, why we exist. And I think that your children don't have the same programming as you. They don't have the same traumas unless you reinforce them on them. And so if you allow yourself to be open to new information, you allow yourself to be open to the intuitive questions that your children ask, right? A lot of times you'll find that some of the things that you subscribe to, some of the practices, some of the values that you subscribe to don't make sense. And in that way, you are allowing your children to raise your standard of being, your standard of existence.
Okay. Let me see if we can, and what I'd like to do is try to get a glimpse into how far you've come along as a father from where you were brought up. So can you tell me a little bit about maybe your father and how he was with you, if he was involved in your upbringing?
Yeah, no, my father's incredible. He um
Let me just say I love that. That's great, man. That's a beautiful, beautiful response. My father is incredible.
yeah.
Nice.
Yeah, no, he's incredible. I mean, he didn't have his father. He was very intentional um about how he raised my sister and my brother and myself. We had lots of talks. I spent a lot of time, especially if I got in trouble, if there was something happening, he spent a lot of time talking to us and listening to us. And so many days when I would get in trouble and I'd actually be like, listen, can you just spank me? Because the lecture was too long, the talking, it was too much talking, right? But it's something that I came to appreciate as a teenager.
Hmm.
And many of the things that he would say to me when I was younger, or many of the conversations that we would have when I was younger, we would revisit when I was older. And so, my father was incredible. He's still incredible. He's still my best friend to this day, and we speak several times a day.
Keith, obviously we all, kind of evolve into our own individuals. But when you look at your fathering style, what do you think most mirrors what your dad, afforded you?
That's the thing. I don't think that my fathering style mirrors my father's fathering style. And I think that his style was specific to who he is as an individual, and it was specific to who I am as an individual. And
So then what would be the contrast then? What would be some of the differences that are significant? I mean, obviously he was incredible, but I'm inclined to believe that you're probably doing an incredible job as well. So it's not about just doing things the way he did. So what then are those differences that you see between your father and yourself?
I think that it's just about information. I think that when I was coming up, we didn't have as much access to information. And so a lot of the investigatory work that I had to do as a child, learning about different things, I did it in conjunction with my father because we had encyclopedias in the house and we went through that process together. I don't do that with my children. My children have phones. They have access to information at their fingertips. So we don't spend a lot of time investigating information together. We spend a lot of time analyzing and critiquing information and challenging information together. With my father, he was much more involved in the formative process of information gathering, whereas with my children, I'm much more involved in the summative process of information or fact checking information.
You mentioned that, aside from the lectures, he also did a lot of listening. Do you think that had a positive impact on you and the way that one, you're fathering, and two, that if so, the way that your children respond to you?
I don't know. I mean, it's not something I don't think it's not something I've really reflected on.
Yeah.
I think that
Well, do you listen to them a lot? Like when they have, you know.
yeah, but I mean, but drawing a correlation to him listening to me, the reason I
Mhm,
don't know
mhm.
I don't know that I can draw that correlation. And again, I
Okay.
think that it's specific to us as individuals. The reason why is because um, I had a lot to say. And so I required him listening. Right. And I think
Okay.
that,
Right.
and I also was the middle child trying to find my voice, find my definition, how I fit in, how I exist was very different. I think that when each of my children are incredibly different, like there is no child in my house that is like the other one. And so they all require very different things. And so with my oldest, I'll spend time listening to her. She's 18, but most of our communication is her listening to me and challenging my ideas. That's what she requires at this point. She doesn't necessarily communicate the same way or as much as, say, my 14-year-old. My 14-year-old has lots of ideas about the world and how things should be. And so I spend more time listening to her because she's doing a lot more talking.
Mhm.
We have 7-year-old twins who are incredibly different. And so it's the same thing. And then we have a 2-year-old, right? And so
Right.
um, I don't know that I'm at the point where I can draw a correlation between how my dad listened to me and
Okay.
how I listen to them.
Mhm, mhm. It sounds like, if it's safe to say, Keith, it sounds like one of the things, having gone through basically an entire season now, that kind of stands you out as a
Mhm.
father is your ability, and this is probably going to be an insight, your ability to recognize each child as an individual and then respond accordingly. So it doesn't sound like you really have a set template that you're going by. You know, I'm the strict dad. I'm the or the the real liberal dad or this. It seems like you're spending a lot of time just getting to know each child individually and fathering according to that.
Yeah, I think you're right.
I know that you are, as you mentioned earlier, that you're an attorney,
Hmm.
and I've spent some time on your site. You've dealt with some pretty high profile cases. One of the things I'd like to know, Keith, is have you seen a correlation with maybe some of the cases that you've had to deal with that have been more on the criminal side?
Hmm.
Have you seen there to be a correlation with not having a father?
I don't know if I see causation.
Mm,
There may be
okay.
correlation between not having a father and someone breaking their social contract with society, right?
Right. Hmm.
But causation, I don't know. The reason why I say that is because I feel like many of the people, the human beings that I deal with on the criminal side, they're accused of breaking their social contract with society or committing crimes. It's usually because of their community's impact on them or their lack of community. When I see kids who have a lack of community, a lack of safety, security, wellness, food, clothing, shelter provided to them by their community, then they seek it in other ways. And sometimes those ways are destructive. And it's not necessarily specific to a father as much as it's specific to community. And so if the community highlights the concept of the missing father, or if the missing father is highlighted in their lives, it creates a void or gap in how they exist. And then that triggers behaviors that may not be conducive to their growth and development. And I think that having community where you have father figures, where you have mother figures, where you have, I mean, not even gender specific figures, but where you just have people that you love, trust, and that love, trust you, and that create a safety net around you, and that provide a framework for how you grow and develop. When you have those things, it becomes hard to fail. It becomes hard to fall out of sync with that community. But when you don't have that, there's no safeguards for you. Or when you come up in a community where criminal behavior is part of the social contract, you're expected to get into a gang because mom or dad is in the gang, or mom and dad is selling drugs, or mom and dad is involved in some other element of behavior that is antagonistic to the criminal justice system. Well, then you can almost expect that young person is gonna get involved in those things.
Hey guys, this is Corey, host of the Dadography podcast. This episode is sponsored by and dedicated to you. Thanks for all your feedback and support. I mean that. However, if this is your first time tuning in, please be sure to subscribe. And if you've done that already and you're getting some value from our interviews with dads from around the globe, please share. Teamwork makes the dream work. Now back to the show. It's reminiscent of one of our earlier shows, which is based on an African proverb that it takes a village to raise a child.
Mm-hmm.
And in your explanation, their community is incredibly important.
Yeah.
I guess the other thing that being an attorney that I'd want to know is, has it affected you as a father? Like, have there been, scenarios or incidences that have prompted you to say, I need to start doing this, or I need to stop doing that?
When you're training as an attorney in law school, and even as you study for the bar, you are training to argue both sides of an argument. Whether or not you agree with one side or the other, you're trained to make arguments for and against positions. And
that's interesting.
And so in that training, you learn the art of argument. You learn the art of being right, whether or not you're right or not. You learn the art of sounding right or trying to sound right. So you bring that training home. And what happens is you can get into a conversation where you're on the wrong side of the facts, you're on the wrong side of the truth, but your training kicks in and you start defending a position as opposed to defining your beliefs. And one of the things that I had to check, or I should say my wife had to check early on, was making sure that I'm not simply defending my position because I'm trained to do that. But when I'm having a conversation at home with the kids about anything, that I'm making sure that I'm listening, and I'm not trying to be right, but I'm trying to get to the right place.
I got to tell you, man, it's one thing that I'm gleaning from you a lot is the communication factor with your girls. It really sounds like a lot of effort is put on your part to make that meaningful and to be a part of you raising them. I noticed also that, among other things, you mentioned your civil rights activism and, the struggle for human equality.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously, with 5 girls, there's a need for some gender equality.
Mm-hmm.
And so what does that look like in terms of your raising them? Probably more so than anything, your oldest. She's 18 and slowly stepping out into the world. What does that teaching or instruction look like?
I think that the idea of gender equality is a problem in and of itself. Here's why. Why are we even having a conversation about whether or not women should be perceived on an equal footing as men? To me, it's the same problem as, we need to have a conversation about racism and Black people being equal in America with white people. The idea that we even have to have a conversation about that is problematic. We start with that as a foundation. We can understand that our issues and problems with gender inequality are so deeply ingrained and so deeply rooted in this society that it's going to be a multi-layered approach to making sure that men are weaponizing their privilege so that we are bringing equity into a space where there historically has not been any. And so the conversation with all of my children, actually, the conversation with them is, you are not responsible for other people's biases. you're responsible for your own. And so when you go out into the world, people are going to throw their biases on you, at you, and towards you. And it's your responsibility to make sure that you do not respond in kind, but that you respond in a way where their biases are left with them, their mismanaged expectations are left with them. And if they are human enough to deal with those biases and those mismanaged expectations about race and gender, then they will heal. But that healing is on them. It's not your responsibility. And I think that's something that's also been driving the conversation about patriarchal privilege, is that we've got a society filled with men that have bruised egos or sensitive egos and are not willing or are not in the space to accept that we're not everything that society needs.
It's a paradigm shift. It's a totally different way of looking at the paternal role for sure.
Mm-hmm.
So you kind of touched on the racism prevalent in and I don't know if it's more prevalent than it has been in the past, but it's definitely more relevant in sense of media play
Mm-hmm.
with Black Lives Matter, recent killings. Have you had to have conversations regarding race and instructions on do's and don'ts? So what does that look like now in the climate of the U.S. And fathering?
It's tough because we live in Brooklyn, and so
Okay.
we consider Brooklyn is a bubble in terms of
Mm.
the bubble of like tolerance and progressive attitudes, and so things look a certain way. However, racism and privilege and how capitalism is driving the divisions between society is tricky. It's not as simple as, you being in a store someplace and somebody calling you the N-word. It's more problematic. And I say that because when George Floyd was killed by those cops in Minnesota, there was an uproar and people started to protest. And so we would see people at protests in Brooklyn. I mean, thousands and thousands of white people protesting with black people in Brooklyn. But we would see people that we know in real life who are problematic, who have racist ideas, ideologies, who are white supremacists. We would see them protesting as well. And seeing them protest, we understood that one, this moment it's the trend, right? To make sure that you try to be perceived as on the right side of history. In addition to that, though, we understood that much of the white supremacist ideals, ideologies that are driving this society are masked, and people don't know or they don't recognize it as white supremacist ideologies. So the conversation with my kids is, understanding that in this society, we don't even need white people to drive white supremacy because we have so many black people that subscribe to it that it becomes its own thing. And so we make sure that we subscribe to a value system that is anti-racist, that is anti-sexist, that is anti-homophobic, that is anti-trans, right? The idea is to make sure that we subscribe to a value system that's in alignment with what we believe. And I think that when we subscribe to that value system, we constantly are challenging what we think, and also how we act, like how we conduct ourselves, our behaviors. And I think that that's the thing that we've been focusing on in my household. We're focused on the revolution is not being televised. The revolution is internal. The revolution happens in your heart, in your mind, and how you conduct yourself. And once you subscribe to that revolution, then you're prepared to lead and be part of another revolution.
Yeah. Very thoughtful. Very well thought out. It seems as though you are definitely spending time giving consideration to the upbringing of your daughters, man. So alongside that, though, Keith, we have this unique time in history with Black Lives Matter, fight for, racial justice, fight for gender justice, etc. What about the change I'm assuming you went through with five girls in the midst of COVID dropping on the planet, right? Like, so there's not a reference book at all on fathering in the midst of COVID. How have you fared with that, man?
COVID became a big catalyst for learning, a big catalyst for a new discipline, in how we look at the world, how we look at each other. I think many of us are very comfortable, or were very comfortable with things that we shouldn't have been. And so having to spend 4 or 5 months in the house, really kind of like just figuring out when we have an issue, we got to deal with it in the house because there's
Right.
nowhere to go, there's nowhere to run. But also in that time, growing closer with one another. In that time, looking at how we spend, what we spend on, and really evaluating like, is our spending, are our financial practices in alignment with our value system? And really having a lot of time to like really reflect on all of these things. And that's not a conversation between just the adults, me and my wife. That's a conversation for the whole family, right? Like we're looking at what we're spending on, looking at like the time that we're spending with people, why we're spending with people. And I think that it became a real calling card for us because then we were like, wait a minute, when we come out of this pandemic, I actually don't even need to spend time with X, X, and X because they're not beneficial to my health, my development, my growth. Me being away from that relationship has actually helped me. Or looking at relationships and saying, wow, I really miss this about this person because this person helps me do this, this, and this. And I think that it really helped us reevaluate all of our relationships and just gave us a lot of time, to be reflective.
What is one thing, and this question is kind of off the cuff, Keith. What is
Mm-hmm.
one thing you wish you knew about fatherhood before you became a father?
I think I got lucky in this regard, but I wish I knew how important partnership was. Fatherhood is nothing without a good partner. And I think that I got lucky in that regards because I have an amazing partner who challenges me, holds me accountable, makes sure that I'm on task, and we do it for one another. And a lot of times, like I'm just super thankful. I'm like thanking God, like, wow, like this is, this couldn't have been better. But I think about people who aren't as privileged or fortunate, who have challenging partners or partners who aren't up to task with the partnership that's required. And what I mean by that is when we come up with a decision about our household, or when we're having a conversation about our household, it would be incredibly destructive for you to have a partner who is undermining the value system that you guys are setting up in the house. And so I think that every person who is thinking about becoming a father needs to make sure that their partner is up to the task.
Well, that's good advice. Good advice. Well, Keith, I tell you what, I want to once again express my sincere thanks to you for you coming on to the Dadography podcast. It has really been a pleasure speaking with you and being able to glean some insights from you as a father in the United States of America, there in Brooklyn.
Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it.
Today's Fatherhood Insight comes from a loving father of 5 girls. Attorney and civil rights activist Keith White gave us 2 lessons really worth remembering. Number 1, if you have more than one child, be mindful they are individuals, so father them accordingly, not in a one-size-fits-all manner. Secondly, talk and listen to your children. Conversing really helps you be a better dad by building the bridge of communication.
We hope you've enjoyed this episode of the Dadography podcast. Thanks very much for listening. I would, however, like to invite you to be a part of this show.
Visit our website at dadography.net. Scroll down to the bottom of the page, click on the microphone, tell us your name, where you're from, and what fatherhood means to you. Remember, it takes more than DNA to be a dad.